Perfect.
Thank you, Ashley, for your patience with the compare of the event.
Absolutely. So everyone is now on mute. We have our recording going, and so I think we're ready to go.
Yeah.
Okay. So I would like to invite you to play with me a little bit today on this new system that I'm using, and maybe this could be a tool that you could use also if you're working with groups or with others. In this time of COVID and having to go online, we have really been able to explore many different platforms for virtual learning. So if you have a phone, a cell phone, a tablet, if you want to open another tab in your internet browser and go to www.menti.com, you can enter this code up top that you see, and that will MENTI.com, right up here at the top. And if you enter this code, that will actually take you to the presentation.
Nice.
And what we're going to be doing is some real-time live audience polling. And this will be anonymous, but I have a couple of icebreaker questions for us to get us situated in our space. And so we'll get to those in just a minute. So thank you so much again for having me. I'm really excited. This is maybe the second time I have really talked about formally the results of my dissertation and the study that I did when I was a doctoral student. And so I'm excited to have this conversation with you all. So our time together today, I'm hoping that I can get to know a little bit about you. I always like to know who my audience is, who I'm talking to, so that I can really situate and bring some context to the things that I have to share with you. And then a little bit more about getting to know me and my own journey to where I am now. And then talk about some relevant findings from my study with leaders and how that might impact you and your work as coaches. So let's get to the first one. So I want to know, what type of Zoomer are you? And if you're on menti.com and you have entered the code at the top, you should be able to see this question and choose what characterizes you the best. Who am I talking to today? We have one person who identifies as the one who talks before unmuting, which is most common. Okay, we have a tie going on between muting and checking out everyone's background. Are they in a room? Are they in a store? What are they wearing?
539982353.
There's a person who is not in any of the categories. They're in the talks while unmuted.
We should have added a fifth category.
Yeah, I would go in that one too.
Talks while unmuted.
Yeah, shouldn't be, but is.
How funny. So we have lots of people who start to talk before they unmute themselves, totally common. We have lots of folks who don't like to have their camera on, also very common. We have some checker outers, and we only have 2 people who are sending emails while Zooming. So I feel really good about the attention span of this group. So that makes me feel really excellent. Awesome. All right, so this is who you're with, people. This is your group. This is, you have a good group. We just have to remind each other to unmute before you start talking. So let's go to the next one. Tell me how long you have been coaching or in relationship with others in a helping role. It may be coaching, it may be consulting, however you want to put that verb in there. Excellent. So we have some very seasoned folks in this group. So that is really great to me, because I really hope to learn with and from you today as well, and hear maybe how you have experienced or applied the concepts of development and fallback to your own work. So this is definitely a mutually beneficial relationship here today in my mind. I hope to learn with, from, and about you all, and hear how you might be applying these concepts as well. So this is really great. So awesome. Lots of folks with lots of experience. This is wonderful. And I hope to learn and hear some questions from those of you who have not been in this role very long, to kind of see what's coming up for you, what things are really piquing your interest about this topic, and how can we think through some of those things. So this is great. Thanks for participating. And then this is our last sort of icebreaker question. I'm kind of curious, and you have space to just type in a free answer, just some words. What are the core challenges that your clients might be facing right now? Ooh, boundary setting, that's a good one. Gosh, COVID really has thrown us all for a loop, huh? Some of us repositioning ourselves after COVID. Leadership in an uncertain environment, work-life boundaries, it's a big one. Ooh. Relying on bullying to get results. Unfortunately, this is one that's a little bit, in my lived experience, has been a common thing in academia. I don't know about the rest of your experiences. Staying connected with colleagues while, I'm assuming, in COVID. Career transitions, absolutely. Someone who's torn between mom and dad, so that's huge. Families can definitely pull us into different ways of making meaning. So yeah, these are all very important and very real lived experiences of your clients. So I'm glad to know a little bit about this. I think it's really interesting as some of the comments about the boundary setting, and what that means in terms of our identity. So this is great. So last one, I lied, if you had one more. I've been told that a lot of you are familiar with vertical development, the concepts of the developmental journey, and of course, fallback from Val. And I'm just curious, from what you know about fallback and development, have you experienced a client or a group that you think has been in fallback? This is great. I love the not sure category, because it's really kind of hard to tell sometimes with the level of probing that we need to do to really understand another person's sort of system of organizing meaning. It's not just something that people wear on their sleeves most of the time. It is something we have to listen for deeply. So I love that honesty and authenticity, that I'm not sure if they have that or not. It is definitely a majority of you have had some signs that your clients, your groups have been in fallback. So good, I invite you to talk about those and share with us as we go along how these things might resonate with what you've experienced in your own work. So this is great. Thank you so much. I feel like I know you already a little bit. All right, so a bit about me. I have spent basically my career in academia. Since 2005, I have been in academic leadership positions. So I do not characterize myself as a professor, even though I do teach courses. I really have been mostly more in academic leadership or research positions. Before that, I was a graduate research assistant with some faculty, and before that, I worked as a seasonal student employee at the CDC in Atlanta, the Centers for Disease Control, and the National Center for HIV, STD, and TB Prevention, which definitely had an impact on me and why I work for a College of Health and Human Services today. So I'm really blending a public health background as well as an adult development, leadership, organization development backgrounds together.
And Ashley, you have 3 children as well, hey? Which you had to doctorate.
I
You
do.
and
I have 3 kids.
Valerie, crazy people.
Yes, that's right. 3 kids along the way who keep us very busy, and who we moved, the whole family. So I grew up in the state of Georgia and have been there all my life. And right after sort of defending my perspectives of my dissertation, I uprooted the entire family from Georgia and moved us all to North Carolina for my job, which was a really big deal because that was kind of my way of rounding out this one developmental journey that I felt like I had been on. In terms of really living out my true, authentic self. And so I had always been captured kind of in that socialized space for a lot of my life, where I did things because I wanted to keep harmony in my family and my friend group. I wanted to be the good daughter, the good employee, the good friend. I didn't want to make waves. I needed to do what I thought they wanted me to do. And as I really began to grow and research and understand and be held in spaces where I could have conversation about growth and development, I really started to kind of make that pivot, that shift into living a more authentic life for Ashley and not for other people. And so this journey here has been really symbolic for me, kind of crossing over into the space where I want to kind of be the CEO of my board of directors and not have a board of directors tell me what I have to do all the time, if I can use that analogy, I believe from Jennifer Garvey Berger. So that's kind of been my journey, and my goal really is to just get exposure from all things that I can to really help me be a better human, a better academic, a better helper, a better parent. And so as we moved here, I've really been exposed to the community in ways that I had not been before. So I am working in the area of community engagement. So I work with hospitals, I work with local nonprofits, I work on issues from lactation support for underserved populations to changing the board structure of a nonprofit that is charged with eliminating racism in our community. So I'm exposed to a lot of things, and I'm also doing that purposefully so that I can continue to grow and develop and really contribute meaningfully to the world. And so those are kind of my subjectivity statements, things about me, the lens through which I view the world and how I conducted my own research. So a little bit about myself. And I wanted to start, some of you may be familiar with Suzanne Cook-Reuter and her work on vertical development, and I know many of you are familiar, but her quote really has spoken to me since I began this research, and she really sees vertical development fundamentally as seeing the world through new eyes, and how we change our interpretations of experience and how we transform our views of reality as we grow and develop sort of in this vertical construct over time. And so she really has set the stage for my work, and how I kind of see our contributions to leadership development and coaching. So in preparing to dissertate, which has become a verb in our worlds now, my work would not be possible without the previous contributions and really groundbreaking work of David McCallum and Val, who is with us today. So I read those two dissertations. McCallum, who found fallback as a phenomenon that does happen to leaders when they are triggered in some way, and Val, who did her research on really working with the scholars and the big thinkers around developmental theory to understand how to situate fallback and what that really looks like and means. And so I said, you know what, I'm going to build on that. Those are very interesting to me. I myself have been in situations where I felt like I was in a situation and was triggered and kind of didn't show up as my best self. And so I wanted to explore that more and understand, what does that mean and how did that hold me back? So I decided to get a group of leaders together and interview them quite a few times and try to understand this phenomenon of fallback. One thing that really helped me a lot when going through this is I attended several workshops through Jennifer Garvey Berger's network, the Growth Edge coaching workshops, which really are rooted in developmental theory. And so those really helped me understand the theory in practice, and how it might look to work with people who were in developmental transitions. So if you don't know her work, I would really highly recommend that you look at that as well. And so the whole process of preparing to do a dissertation and then actually getting into it and doing it can be really triggering. I had lots of feelings of imposter syndrome. I had lots of feelings of this isn't good enough. I'm doing this wrong. What if my results aren't good? So I kind of fell back a little bit into some spaces of thinking that really were not helpful for me. And so I had to get to a point where I felt comfortable finding my voice and my own authentic self and really owning the process and what I did and what I found. And that is still something I struggle a little bit with today, but I am aware of that and I'm getting better at really addressing that. So something that Jennifer Garvey Berger has said, and I believe Val quoted her as well in her dissertation, is that vertical development really isn't about being better. It isn't about good or bad or about being a high stage or a low stage. It really is about this bigness of perspective and how can we continue to grow and develop and widen our ability to hold multiple perspectives and understand really how we operate individually and in a system of the world. And so really this helped me when I was talking with my interview participants, my study participants, because there was no judgment there. And so I could really show up and be present for each person because I was trying to understand their bigness of perspective. What in their world was the most that they could hold? What was their developmental journey? What were they experiencing? So I think this concept of bigness of perspective is really important because it allows us to kind of empathize with people and put that judgment on the back burner. There is no judgment. This isn't about being right or wrong or good or bad. It's about how much and how much growth are we doing, can we do to be better actors together in the world. And so, yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, Ashley. There's a question here about defining fallback, and I'm sure you're going to do it later. I'm just checking in about that.
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
cool.
Yeah.
Letting you roll in.
Yeah. So a lot of my whole dissertation was really built on this notion of constructive development and how we grow and construct our meaning and our identity over time, as you know. And I really worked with the subject-object relations theory. So in my work, I'm not sure, I know some of you do the Enneagram assessment and other assessments. I use the subject and object interview assessment to work with my participants. And this is a format for talking with your clients or participants to really deeply probe how they are making meaning of the world. What can they see as their meaning-making systems in their identity, and what is kind of not able for them to access and see. And so it's a series of questions, it's a process of probing to really capture a moment in time for what is the most complex, the highest order of mind that someone is able to have at any given time. And so that in and of itself kind of presents a little bit of a challenge, in my opinion, when talking about fallback. Because when you do sort of this assessment, you are getting a snapshot of a person and what they're able to hold, right? So is their highest level a 3, a socialized stage? Are they a 4, a self-authored stage? But when you talk about fallback, or this inability to access those highest stages, that momentarily or episodically losing your ability to show up in that most complex way. It's really difficult, I think, to do that because it requires further probing. And really in the moment probing is probably the best way to get to fallback. But a lot of times we can't be there with our clients. We can't be there with our leaders or our participants. And so we have to rely on recall. We have to rely on our folks telling us what they thought happened, and then probing after the fact. And so that's a little bit of a difficulty that I found throughout my study was, am I getting true fallback? Am I really able to assess if that person kind of regressed or went back in their thinking, their ability to make meaning of something, or not? And so that's just some attention that I think I held, and that those of you might hold still when you're talking with your clients and trying to assess, okay, was that fallback? How do I know that that's fallback? Do I know enough about my clients' meaning-making structures and how they organize meaning to know if there was a downshift, so to speak? And so something that I came to kind of later in my research, but has really helped me now understand kind of what I found, was this concept of the yin and yang of human development, which I'll talk about in just a second. So I wanted to show you kind of where my folks were. My folks over here, my study participants, really ranged in their meaning making. This is actually kind of a tight box, so this is fairly indicative of where adults tend to be at this stage in life. And my folks were middle-aged, roughly. And so this isn't a necessarily diverse sample. I would love to have gotten a little bit more diversity in there in terms of their developmental stage. But this is where they were, and this is what I had to work with.
Ashley, can I interrupt with that last slide? Because we use a different set of terms which are quite close to Torbit actually. But just to run through that, so people that know our assessment can kind of fit it into the structure here. So we don't really look at opportunists much, but Simon, chip in, because you know the memory. The diplomat we use, specializing instead of expert, performing instead of achiever, internalizing instead of individualist, strategizing and transforming. So very similar. You can kind of figure out how our system works in with that. And yeah.
That's
Thanks.
great. And I would love to hear more about that actually as we go along. I welcome anyone to stop or throw in some facts for us to think about. So yeah, so this is where my folks were. And so this is where, this really informed where and how I would probe them for, you know, thinking about and understanding what happened to them when we were talking about the triggers, the stories, the challenges, the things that were really happening to them as leaders that were causing them to not really show up as their fullest self developmentally. And so I like to think about the developmental journey sort of over those different stages or logics, kind of like looking at these paint swaths, you know, like each one is a little bit of a different gradient, and then each person has their own developmental journey that's also a little bit of a different gradient as they go up or back. And so this entire swath represents a whole person. And we really have the ability, I found through my folks, to really move up and down that spectrum, right? So we can hold the highest that we can hold, but that also means that we can access and incorporate all of those previous stages or those previous colors or gradients on that line. And so that kind of helped me to understand that humans really aren't super static, right? That we are fluid, we are moving, we are back and forth. That just is what development and meaning making is. So I had a couple findings, and really those lined up very nicely with things that David McCallum and Val found as well in their studies. I did find that most folks in my group tended to fall back into a more socialized meaning-making space where they were much more concerned about the impacts or the identity as part of a group or a part of someone else's perspective. So not wanting to make someone else mad, or what would this mean for the company if I left or didn't lead this particular team. And so some of those folks that did fall back kind of did that unconsciously, I would say, maybe sporadically in the moment. And I did have at least one other participant who actually chose, he had more of an awareness of those particular ways of showing up. And he actually was able to choose in the moment kind of what self he needed to show up with. Did he need to be more opportunist to get his team what they needed? Did he need to be more socialized in his thinking to help a team pull through something? So it was much more for that one participant an ability to say, okay, I know how I'm going to show up and how I need to act and what kind of mind I need to show up with, and I'm going to choose that based on what the outcome is that I needed. And then vulnerability really serving as this catalyst for kind of recognizing where you have sort of been developmentally. So I was not able to probe for changes or shifts. So my study wasn't really about saying, did someone grow or not? My study really was about, did someone shift in their meaning making at a particular time? How did that shift look? What did it prevent them or help them to do? And then were they able to kind of recenter? And for the most part, people were. So what enables the fluidity of meaning making? So Neffelkamp, David McCallum, and Livesay kind of said that there are a couple of situations or triggers that would maybe enable fallback to happen. So that would enable someone to get triggered in the moment and then maybe move back into their meaning making and their way of thinking. And some of those triggers or situations would be being put into new learning environments, general stress, stresses of the day, stresses of work, challenges to our identity. If I'm not this, then who am I? If I'm not part of this team, who am I? I don't have a team, who am I? Uncertain contexts. So lots of these things came up in our first poll about some of the things that your clients are facing, same things that mine were in the study. Having to really problem solve and address sort of adaptive challenges and technical challenges as well. So those were some areas where we saw a fluidity of meaning making. So we saw a back and a forth. Maybe it was back a little bit here and a forward a little bit there, back to their center of gravity. And so yes, all of these folks contributed to, and really my study affirmed what they found, is that these triggers really are the things that enable fluidity to happen, right? That kind of exist in this whole space of how we show up in the world and how we make meaning of situations. So in terms of contextualizing fallback and fluidity, I really was looking at what was happening to my people in the study that was really making them go into some sort of fallback and what I would then really label as sort of fluidity. So what was allowing them to move in this space? Some of my folks were taking on new leadership roles that really challenged them to be and show up differently, which would either have been much more self-authorized or self-transforming. One of my folks, and this may have happened to some of your clients as well, was really dealing with a problem employee that needed to be reassigned and was really struggling with not wanting to anger a boss or to not have any friends if they were to make a decision versus what was really right for the organization, regardless of what that appeared or looked like on the surface. So doing the hard thing, even if it meant that it wasn't the popular thing. Lots of my folks were having to make big decisions for an organization, and the stress of that was really enabling them to kind of fall back in their meaning making at times and then show up as their true self at other times. So really trying to face how to be an adaptive leader was something that was really triggering this fluidity of meaning making. And then again, some fears. I had some folks that were afraid of being alone in the workplace. They were afraid of their own success. They were afraid of angering a supervisor. And so some of these are just sort of some themes that showed up throughout my participants and were sort of the foreground for why fallback happened and why there was this fluidity, this back and forth of meaning making. And again, for those folks that actually chose a fallback position because it was a strategy, I would say more of a strategy than a way of making meaning, but they did that sometimes out of self-preservation, sometimes because they had to solve a problem and showing up as an opportunist or a strategist in that moment was much more profitable for whatever that problem was than coming at it from a different perspective. And so I just want to talk about really bringing awareness to the possibility that individuals, depending upon where they have progressed sort of in the spectrum of vertical development, some of them can choose. They have enough awareness about themselves. They have enough awareness about how they show up and make meaning to actually choose a different position. And so that also is fluidity. Some of us, go ahead.
I'm an interrupter.
That's okay.
I'm just curious about, I suppose it's a slightly bizarre moral dimension on this whole thing. That, you know, say you're Donald Trump and you have access to greater good and you actively choose individual good repeatedly through an act of choice. I'm just curious about the moral dimension here, because even myself, I know I have some terrible elements in me that are deeply opportunistic and advantage taking or bullying even. And to choose that.
Yeah, and so I think one of the things that we sometimes get trapped in when we think about development is that different stages mean good or bad. You can be a higher stage and be able to understand your own identity and yourself as part of a system and be self-transforming and still be a real jerk, right? Like you can still be those things. Both of those things can be true. So where you are on the developmental spectrum, your morals hopefully aren't that terrible, but they could be if that's a choice that you're making. Now, I've had a lot of conversations with people about that particular person that you mentioned and where he might be on that particular spectrum. When I using Keegan's sort of framework, the 2, 3, 4, 5 framework, 2s and 4s can sound and look very much alike. 3s and 5s can sound and very much look alike. 2s and 4s are very much about more of the individualistic perspective. And so that makes total sense for him. He sounds very much like he is self-authored and he can hold multiple perspectives and make a really great choice based on those. And he understands that he has a meaning-making system, but most of the time he's showing up as a 2, very opportunistic, very morally corrupt in some people's eyes. So that is a hard thing, and that's actually something that tripped me up when doing some of the practice rounds to get certified to do the subject-object interview, is that I myself got triggered when I would read a transcript of someone who showed up at a higher stage, but wasn't necessarily a great person. And so I wanted to score them lower. I wanted to be like, ew, you are totally a whatever stage. I wanted to put judgment on that person because the moral piece was really bothering me so much. And I had to sort of suspend that and really kind of understand and take in that your meaning making doesn't necessarily mean that your morals are good or bad. And then who decides if those are good or bad, right? So what you think is bad may be good to that person. So I think that's a great question.
Yeah. And that's a great answer. And it really helps. You know, there's this whole debate in the field about a whole lot of coaches who work in this area, and we're all late stages and we're all frankly fabulous. And, you know, making that sort of kind of judgment about late stage people is not very helpful to really anyone. And so what you said helps to sort of horizontalize, if that's the right word, the typology a little bit, that it's better for what. I don't know, Valerie, I can see something is moving your brain. I can see, yeah.
I remember to unmute. No, I think that Ashley's response is a great one. We do tend to think that later is better and gooder. We are gooder people. The further along we are developmentally, and that would be lovely. And it's just that's not what the theory says, and I don't think that's what real life says. Just like earlier stage individuals are not bad, they're not badder. You know, we're all of it. We're all kind of these messy, complex human beings. And I appreciate, Julia, you're pointing to the fact that, you know, you've got this bully in you. I have this bully in me. You know, we show up with the fullness of ourselves, and sometimes that's sweetness and light, and sometimes it's just not.
Can I throw something in? Just on the point of greater good and world leaders, and I only read this morning, and it was so beautiful I had to write it down, and just thinking about Trump as well. And the quote was, "The welfare of the people in particular has always been the alibi of tyrants." And I just thought that was absolutely beautiful and speaks to exactly that point. As I listened to Trump saying about how his primary concern was saving lives in COVID at the moment.
Do you mind sharing where you saw that quote?
Yeah, it was on, I will, I'll put it on the chat rather than take up time now.
Perfect.
I will.
Yeah, so I think that's the kind of the beauty and the paradox of a theory like this is that...
Oh, sorry, Ashley, it's the interrupter. There's a beautiful question that relates to the last discussion.
Go right ahead.
And it is Trish saying, I don't know, Trish, you want to say it?
Yeah, I do, because this really freaks me out. I get very stuck with this question. And I think that for me, it really is about vertical development in service of what? And maybe I've just got a fantasy that development is around a higher level of consciousness. And if I have a higher level of consciousness, I have a bigger impact for good. So if I'm able to have a bigness of perspective, what is the point of that if I can't bring good into the world? So I guess it does go back to my question. Vertical development in service of what?
Yeah, I think that you will see there are some scholars, Herdman, Barker, and Wallace, and I'll put up a slide about them in a little bit, really have a great description of the developmental journey as being how we come to know ourselves in a more integrated way, and then aligning that purpose with a shared purpose, so a shared greater good. So people can choose to be on a developmental journey or not. Some people may come to you and say, I feel like something's just not right. Like I'm outgrowing something. I feel like there's more there. I want to contribute more. And so as a coach, I would love for someone to come to me with that sort of perspective so that I could say, okay, well, there is this thing called a developmental journey. Do you want to take it? How can I help you do that? And here is what one of their purposes can be of a developmental journey. It is to be a more integrated self and system with the world, because why are we all here? You know, what are we doing here if it's not to contribute in some way, whatever that way is? I think some other scholars of development, like Erickson, will say too that the latest stage in his model, where you enter into your 60s, so to speak, and this was done many years ago, really was about how do I contribute to the greater good in the world. So he had a whole stage about connectivity and co-generating goodness and purpose, and really reaching, like you said, sort of a higher stage of consciousness, right? Of being aware of yourself, and yourself is part of the system, and the system is impacting you, and all of those things that go together. So developmental journeys aren't for everyone. But I think the beauty of the theory is that it allows us to understand first ourselves and where we're showing up and how we're coming across and what we're thinking, and then how to meet others and our clients where they are, to better understand how to help them through whatever it is, whatever our purpose is in relationship to them, whether that's to help them through a situation, to help them grow personally and professionally, and that it's all messy. It's all this fluidity back and forth kind of all the time, because we're human and we get triggered. And so we don't always show up as our best selves, even though that biggest self is in there.
So I just want to stay with this for a moment, because I'm just thinking about, so I mean, we've had this debate, you've spoken about Trump. I think that Hitler came out from an assessment point of view as a strategist. You know, and that's probably just an opinion. I just think, I guess my question is really around, even if he doesn't want to, or even if the person that you're working with, you're not gonna work with the lens of vertical development if the person doesn't want to go on a development journey. But just in terms of assessing somebody at a certain stage of development, and you were speaking about a moral line. You know, so I mean, to me, within the stages of development, you've got lines of development, you've got cognitive development, you've got an emotional development, you've got spiritual development, you've got and moral development. So my question is, surely in order to be assessed at a certain level of development, your lines of development must have reached a certain level. So even if there's a cognitive development, you know, somebody's reached a certain cognitive stage of development, surely in order to be placed at a center of gravity that's at strategizing, their moral development line must be at some higher level. I don't know, to me there must be some. And then I promise I'm going to drop with Julia.
This is a source of great discussion in our community. I know Anne has been in it. Anne, maybe you want to share what we've been talking about here.
Yes, it is, indeed. And I'm with Trish on this one as well. Yeah. It's a paradox, you know, it's all I can say is I guess we just have to rest with the paradox of perhaps we just have to be able to hold that uncomfortable possibility that a person who is at a more expanded identity stage is morally corrupt. You know, it's Trish, what can I say? It's an ongoing topic, and it arose out of a conversation with Hitler, and it stays with us. So I don't have any gems or pearls. It's just very troubling, though. It's troubling, and I don't want to make this about the Aephoria development process, but it's troubling, and it's something that I think we need to continue discussing so that we can really chew on it and come through with something, because I feel like we keep leaving it. And I would love to have another conversation where we really dig into this and go somewhere with it.
So next week's supervision is on racism at late stages. So we definitely are going to go there, and we are going to explore it. And I see Mary, and I just want to say, like, no, Trish, it seems like you can be low moral development and high everything else, and you still get into late stages. But I can see there's Churn, there's Mary, and thank you, Anne, and there's other people. Sorry, Ashley.
Fine.
Mary.
I was just going to say, I've always been fascinated with the archetype of Lucifer, the light bearer, which I think is really fascinating, because since the beginning of time, there's been this duality between goodness and badness. And the greatest of the angels was Lucifer, the light bearer. So I don't think that this is an answer that we're going to we're going to solve. I think there is a complex duality at the core of, you know, to use the light bearer idea. In the fallen state of humankind, there is this duality. And I think you have to rise above it completely in order to solve the duality. So anyway, that's just what came to my mind from my childhood.
Lovely. Beautiful. And I think it's quite nice in the discussion of fallback, because you can see how the idea of good and bad has a fluidity too.
Well, and I think just something that we've been experiencing here is my colleagues and I have been in a lot of discussion and creating space for discussion around racial inequality, equity, health disparities, implicit bias, and having to come to the realization that we're all going to have some bias, and it is on us as a choice to educate and understand and correct ourselves, and it's will probably likely always be there to some degree, and how we react to that, I think, is really telling. So being at a higher, you know, later stage, and having all that comes with that, right, with being a 4 or a 5 or an ironist or whatever the stage may be, and then being faced with our own implicit bias, and how we react to that. So if we're very defensive, you know, is that because that's going back to self-protectionism, like how much of this is protecting ourselves from something that we don't want to experience? Or feeling badly or shame about what we think or have done, in a different kind of moral aspect in terms of bias. So I think these are great questions, and would love to know the outcome of some of your further discussions on them and how you reconcile sort of the moral and the developmental lines, and what is choice, what is something that we do to protect ourselves. Can you both be happening at the same time, kind of a process. So yeah, anything else on that?
No, there's some really good references that I'm just cutting and pasting into an email so everyone can keep records, you know, great references from people.
So this article kind of changed my, I came to this very late in my process, but I still go back to it today because I find it to be really relevant. And it's this article titled Imperfect Beauty, Hierarchy and Fluidity in Leadership Development, by Elaine and Nancy. And this is their graphic that they've developed to kind of demonstrate what fluidity looks like. And it's sort of situated in this yin and yang type process where we have this hierarchical sort of perspective of vertical development, that it's increasing in complexity. There are very distinct stages. You can compare and contrast all of them as they go up, and it kind of stays in this sort of static unit, but then you've got this fluidity that's always happening around it. There's this, we are humans, we have these embodied experiences, we have imperfect movement back and forth. A lot of our memory lies within our bodies and can trigger us in different ways, which can create fluidity and moving back and forth in our meaning making. And so I thought the visual of this was really, it was important to me to kind of see how these things can coexist together. And the fluidity really is something that's happening all around us. We really are kind of moving back and forth, depending upon what is happening in our context. So I teach a human sexuality for health educators class, and I've been doing a lot of work in this space of gender identity and gender and identity development. And so kind of looking at developmental fluidity as sort of this a non-binary process. It's all of these things, all of these stages combined, that we don't have to just be one thing or another. We can be all of those things. And that's really what the theory says anyway, is that you are all of those stages combined up until whatever the highest stage is that you can hold. And so you always have access to those things, whether you do that unconsciously or consciously. And then something that I've been working with, and I'm not sure if you all have worked in this space yet, but is working with Cooper Ryder's work around appreciative perspectives, and really trying to help people understand, you know, what is the best, what's working well where you are. And then if they want to take that developmental journey, you know, what is the best that could be. And understanding that fallbacks are part of the process. They are part and parcel of being a human. I think Val said that you can't divorce human development from leadership development. They are one and the same. We are humans, and we might have a role in leadership, but it's all about development. It all impacts the other. And so I don't know if you've done any work in the appreciative inquiry space, but being in conversation with yourself and with your clients about, you know, what's working well, even though things might not be, what's the best of what could be going forward. Going on the developmental journey means accepting that there's going to be some back and forth and being okay with that it is messy. But really trying to understand those patterns that are happening and being able to bring awareness to those patterns and how that is impacting your work so that you can make those shifts. And I always like to go back to Keegan's notion of this bridge, of this evolutionary bridge from one stage to another. And really as a coach, kind of walking with your client back and forth over that bridge as they work through these sort of developmental balances or these truces, so to speak. If they're moving into a 4 but kind of pulling back to a 3, you might only get to halfway up the bridge. If they're completely, you know, developed into another stage, then they're all the way over the bridge. But being prepared to walk back and forth with your client and getting your steps in through that developmental journey. And so how can, you know, understanding and knowing that there is this process called adult development, that it does look a certain way, that theoretically on the books we have it being a very stepwise process. But the reality of it is that it's very messy and it's always back and forth. I'm sure some of you have seen that graphic that talks about this is what we think success looks like, and it's kind of an invert, a straight line up, right? Like it's a proportional relationship. Increasing over time, but success really is kind of this up and down and back and forth, and it's this big mess of lines. And development, to me, is kind of the same way. And so as a coach, kind of creating that holding environment, that space where clients can be okay to explore those times when they're moving back and forth, when they might be triggered into a fallback experience. And if they can recognize that and name it and see it and kind of see the patterns that go along with it, how can we then help bring them out into a more spacious way of dealing with whatever that is triggering them. So I think that's all. My last note was just to embrace the fluidity of the fluidity. So it's constantly moving, and the higher, you know, the later that you go in the stages, the more fallback there could be, because there's more stages to fall back to. But it's neither good nor bad if you can name it, bring awareness to it, and kind of overcome those things that are triggering you.
Can we ask you questions?
Yeah.
So I absolutely I love this idea of fluidity. Unfortunately, when I hit the low notes and then I start coming out of the low notes, I'm often so ashamed of how I've behaved that I can't get myself back towards a high note, and as it were. And I'm just would love to hear your insights on that and how you would help somebody through that.
And so what I think I heard you say is that sometimes you have a moment where you're not showing up the way that you want to. And then how do you show up the next time the way that you want to, or how do you deal with the feeling that that has caused?
So my suspicion is, so I get very ashamed of what I've done, and often it takes me a very long time to realize what I've done, and then it's the shame itself, how I feel about the error, that prevents me from moving more into a later stage. How do you?
So I had
fluidity going.
So I had a study participant who actually did that very thing. So Lindsay in my study had a moment where she did not show up as what she thought of as her best self with her team. She blew up at them. She had very judgments about them. It was an ugly mess. And afterwards, she felt very badly about that. After some reflection, she ended up going back and apologizing and acknowledging that her choice of words was poor, but it stuck with her because it stuck with her long enough for her to bring it up in our interview, and it had happened quite a bit before that had happened. So for her particularly, and now my work with her was not a coaching relationship. So in research, it's very much just get facts. Any kind of a coaching moment is really seen as an intervention and could impact the results of your study. So I had to be super careful about interacting with her in a way to probe that. But the probing with her, the questioning in and of itself really helped her to understand how she could let go of that shame, so to speak. And that understanding it was not the totality of who she is. It was a moment in time. It was a trigger, and understanding that and going back and saying to her team, this is what happened, this is why I did that, was helpful. But she had to get to a point where she had to understand that that didn't define who she was. And so that was a growth moment, I think, for her. We didn't get there. I don't know if it was or not. In my anecdotal opinion, I think it was for her, just based on some things that she said. But she came to understand that was a fallback moment. That's not who I was. I'm not fused with that moment and that behavior. That is something that I did, and I can apologize for that or remedy that and move forward and know that I have to be aware of that trigger the next time and understand deeply where did that come from, and how can I do better. So I don't know if that totally answers your question.
Yeah. It helps a lot. So it's actually the naming and reframing of the incident that you use to get rid of the shame. And then I can see how shame can prevent fluidity, because as far as I understand your work, you got to keep fluid. You got to keep moving. So I could see how shame could keep me going up and down at earlier stages. And I'm wondering if there are other feelings that prevent the fluidity as well.
May I just offer some thoughts on the shame part? So first, I want to say I've read Ashley's full dissertation, and it's fabulous, and such a gift to the community and to my own research to have these lived experience perspectives explored. And so I'm super grateful for Ashley and her work and her participants. And I love Lindsay and her in her research, because she's just so so if you haven't read the dissertation, go and look for Lindsay, because I think she's so explicit in her descriptions and sharing her experience of what that fallback experience feels like, looks like, what happened, then what did you do? And Ashley did a beautiful job of probing to get at that, and then how do you grow from it? As I recall, Ashley seemed to have grown a lot, I think, over time, but also, whether intended or not, as researchers, we do have an impact on our participants. But beyond Lindsay and Ashley's research, one of the things that stood out to me from Ashley's research is the role of acceptance. So Ashley mentioned in her presentation earlier this vulnerability aspect, and there were several people in her research that pointed to having someone that they could go to and be vulnerable and share those shame, those smaller parts of self, and be accepted and loved because of those parts of self, not in spite of, and be joined with. And this, I'm outside the confines in my own research of not being able to help people grow, and as I probe their experience, but that has been true for me in my own research with individuals and my own lived experience of fallback myself. Is acceptance is key to acceptance of self, that this is all of us. This is not something to be pushed off, that's not me. This is me, because God knows that me is coming to meet this me again and again and again. So let's make friends and get to know each other. But also the acceptance that we can be loved even in our experiences of shame is incredibly helpful in us being able to accept ourselves.
Beautiful. Thank you, Val.
And I'm not sure who said this. I'm sure it's someone brilliant like Renee or Val or Glennon, but becoming friends with yourself, giving yourself grace, understanding that you are all of the things that come with you, and making friends with yourself can help you understand that it's who we are. Something that you do doesn't define the totality of who you are as a person. And yeah.
So I love that. And I know I'm not talking a lot, but I'd love to just push it a little bit further. Can I do that? Has anyone else got something pressing? I want to dominate. Okay, so this is a bit of a blast. So there's a lot of stuff written about neoliberalism and how the way of understanding people's existence in a neoliberal economy, how what happens is that that system forces the pain into the individual. So the individual becomes responsible and goes into fallback. So, for example, so this has come out in my research. So I was looking at stuckness, and at the beginning, I was looking at stuckness as a function of the individual and thinking, oh, it's always the individual's fault. They're the one that's stuck. They haven't done their work. They, addicted, or they were this or that. But the more research I do, the more I see the context, and in particular neoliberal context. And Simon is going to give the references because he's also looking at this. But there are people like Smell and other people that say actually fallback stroke stuckness, most of this is about a context and an expression of the context which suddenly becomes owned by the individual. And the individual then has to become responsible for it. Simon, what's the author? And is it Smale?
So there's a lot. Well, there's David Smale, who talks about psychotherapy and power and context and social stuff. The neoliberalism stuff that I'm reading at the moment is by a woman called Julie Wilson, who comes at it from a cultural perspective. But it's a beautiful, very accessible, incredibly well-written history to the present day of neoliberal ideas and their impacts on people, particularly psychologically. And the transfer, exactly as Julia says, of responsibility from the government to the individual, which has brought its own anxieties and challenges, and born an entire industry of self-help, by the way. So Julie Wilson, go and read that. It's a lovely red book. You can even get it free on Zed Books if you're feeling slightly crooked.
Well, and that is super interesting to me, because looking at, if you believe that the world is socially constructed, that we create this world by being in relationship with each other, is it a both and? Is it an either or? Can you be stuck and it be a personal, something you need to work through, and the system that you're in, the culture that you're in, prevents those things from happening? So I think that's fascinating to think about, almost like the chicken or the egg kind of situation. But this, to me, power trumps everything, no pun intended, but culture eats strategy for lunch. I'm sure some of you have heard that in your teachings, right? Like your context and your situation and your environment will kill you every single time, no matter how much work you do, because it's a system and it's got power, right? And where are those power imbalances? But as an individual, what is on you to work on? And does it even matter if you're in a system that's not going to honor that? So we have those discussions a lot around here. I don't know where I fall on that either, but I definitely want to check out Wilson's work, because that's fascinating.
Yeah, and how complicit the whole coaching sector is in this. So if you fall back, sorry for you, you're the problem. It's not because your context is dreadful. And anyway, I can go. It's just a really interesting debate, and very helpful for people who have gone into terrible states and done awful things and can't understand why. Okay, from Ingrid as well. So I'm just copying and pasting all of these fantastic references, so that, into the email with the copy of this discussion, so you can have a look.
Does the uncertainty, let me back up. Does the term fluidity and messiness bring up feelings of uncertainty and messiness for you as a coach? Is that liberating? Is it constraining? Is it easier to have things in a tight box? Is it easier to have this notion that we are not all operating at one thing all the time in one space, that things are not static? As a coach or a helper, how does that feel?
Yeah. Something we talk about a lot. Anybody want to comment, or is it just going to be me guessing away?
I'll just offer that that when I entered into my own research on Fallback, it was because this tight box thing around my biggest capacities and perspectives and all of that, I just knew that that wasn't true. And that's what the theory seemed to say. Now, the theory doesn't actually say that, but I didn't know that at the time. It took me dissertating to figure that out. And so what caused me to want to explore fallback in my research was this idea that, gosh, am I an anomaly on this? Like, am I the only one who is not showing up in this center of gravity, this space that I should be, that I can be all of the time? So the fluidity, the messiness is incredibly freeing, I think, for me, and validates my lived experience. It validates me. I don't feel like an outlier. I feel like part of something that can't possibly be put into a cleanly, well-defined box.
And just to be argumentative, I'm just wondering if that's got something to do with where you sit as a center of gravity, that maybe if you were sort of like a diplomat, it would be very disturbing if you couldn't fit into a box.
Yeah, for some people, there's a transformational moment that has to happen to click, to get us to realize that there's something more, there's something different, there's something we're outgrowing something that has always felt good. So being in a tight box feels really good, and you start feeling constrained and claustrophobic, and that there's something that happens that triggers you to be like, maybe it needs to be expanded. Maybe I need to break a wall down of that box, and another wall and another wall. And so I think it's interesting to think about what those experiences are. There's sort of, if it could be a big transformation, it could be a nudge, like Val said, like this just isn't quite fitting anymore. What else is there about this? And I would like to just also honor being in trusted spaces with others to process fallback, which also, again, is important for just the developmental journey in and of itself. And I don't know if you have felt this way, but I can feel when I am in an environment that's helping to bring me up in my way of thinking. And I can feel when I'm in an environment that's not. And so having space like this to talk with other people and hear myself and hear others and have these conversations and dialogue about these things is really helpful to that growth opportunity. And I lost a little bit of that environment when I moved up here, just by the nature of not knowing anyone yet, and not being in the spaces I was familiar with. So I've had to really seek out those spaces and those people to have these conversations with, to help, at least personally, keep me in a way of thinking that's really true to where I want to be and what feels good.
I'd be interested. Sorry.
No, please go ahead.
No, I'm just on that point of fluidity. I'd be really interested to hear more from people who are working in the corporate space a bit more around how this notion of uncertainty around our human condition lands in corporates in particular, because often I think in our experience, we're asked to provide some level of certainty around that which is deeply uncertain, which is the human condition. And there's an element of backlash / we get thrown out sometimes when we can't provide that certainty because our perspective is people are fluid. And I just wonder what other people's experience of that is, because I suppose we're caught in this slight double bind of wanting to be authentic to the work and also needing to work. How have other people experienced that? Because I know it's something we wrestle with a little bit. Yeah.
Can I say something? Even if I'm not so experienced with the corporates, but what I find at present quite helpful is the notion that we are operating in very different systems. And in the different systems that we operate in, whether it's a work system or it's a friend system or it's a family system, we may have different stages of maturity as well as of fluidity. So Ashley's example, I've moved to a new place, so I don't have the support system that I need, that I was used to. Hence, I have a little sort of more insecurity. For me, that is a very helpful thing to see where people are at in their various roles, to use an old term, and go with that and allow the fallback to happen. We often call that resistance, where people are stuck and they regress. And I think the regression and the resistance for us as interveners, as consultants, is gold, because that shows where the reality is. And it doesn't have to be overcome. So if I can differentiate where is the issue, where is the stuckness, I think I can be quite helpful in that very specific place without giving up on the others and without taking over the responsibility for the complexity that there is.
That's a beautiful insight. Sure. Very helpful. Very nice way of working. Wow.
So one of the triggers that I identified in my research for fallback is, I think what you're describing, contextual gravitational pulls. So we are said to have this center of gravity, developmental capacity, and when we walk into different systems, our work system, our family system, our friend system, those systems, those individuals within those systems have their own center of gravity. The systems themselves have their own center of gravity, and those can exert pressure on our center of gravity and pull us sometimes forward, as Ashley was talking about, those places where we know that we can be bigger, more vulnerable, more exploring, and they can pull us smaller into a smaller self. And so knowing, like even being able to identify, okay, the center of gravity of this place is this on the best day, and we're probably not in the best days, right? So I'm going to anticipate that it's actually going to be here. Setting expectations low is super helpful, actually, for how people are going to show up. And then being able to kind of steel yourself, support yourself accordingly to meet what you feel that gravitational pull will be. I'm not a scientist in that way. Like there must be some kind of calibration language that we could use about, how do you bring up your own gravitational capacity so that you don't get sucked down into the black hole of this context.
Yeah. You know what?
Yeah, just 1 second. I have one little comment about that. So about going back to the question about uncertainty in the corporate context and that particular comment, just as a story that I can share from my own work life now is that I have shared a lot of my research and the theories with my supervisor. And he has really latched onto this notion of everything is gray. He has decided that we have got to operate in this everything is gray, we need to stop looking for certainty. And he is really pushing that on people. And that is really a hard line for a lot of folks to get behind who are in an earlier stage. And it's, I'm not going to say dangerous, but it can be detrimental. So we're having to sort of calibrate that to Val's point, using some of that type of language. Like, you can't just go to everyone in a staff meeting and say, everything is gray, so good luck figuring out what your job is today and what you're supposed to produce. Like, that just is not, that goes over like a lead balloon. It's just, no, there are going to be people, you could see the anxiety on some people. One of them is my supervisee. She just gets white with sickness. She can't handle that. And so then we have to kind of go back and say, okay, well, this is kind of what that means, and let's figure out a way to operate and exist within that. What can we control? What can we produce? And then what he's saying is, to a degree, it's okay if it's not perfect or not right? Whatever this context is that we're in may take a couple failures, may take a couple steps back and forth to get it where we need to be. And what he wants to say is that's okay. Instead, he's coming out, everything is gray. It's all gray. We don't know what we're doing. We should just all calm down. And so we're trying to calibrate that message a little bit within my own workspace. And that's challenging.
I could see that. My question is, we've got an unusual person here today, and it's you, Klaus, so don't look so shocked.
I couldn't help that.
So, Klaus is an expert on the Enneagram, one of the global experts on the UR. And the Enneagram has got its own little system of fallback. And I'm curious what insight we can draw from the Enneagram system of fallback. The lines of integration, disintegration, whatever. And how useful that might be to this work. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts, Klaus?
So what I can report is that I'm feeling very hot in my body. I'm blushing.
Oh, sorry.
I feel a little bit disorientated. And the reason for that is that I'm not an Enneagram specialist.
Klaus?
Yes.
Well, then I should be the one, but okay. You know what? It's me that should be blushing and feeling embarrassed.
Well,
because
I'm doing it with you.
I've had a menopausal fallback moment, and I'm going to have to blame biology because I'm so deeply embarrassed. I don't want to enter a deep passage of shame. I'm just going to float menopause past the screen. I'm very sorry. I got you confused with someone else.
No worries.
And then I'm going to take the pressure off you.
I'm glad we're both confused, because it was only one of us that it would be really confusing.
I'm so sorry, Klaus. Eek.
No worries.
Do you want to make a comment anyway?
So I think my area of focus is much more the process work of Arnold Mandel, and so the aspect of fluidity is absolutely ingrained at the heart of it, where every moment is brand new, and a lot of what we have to do is drop identity. And so I see some parallels with dropping identity and the growth that we're talking about. And obviously when we drop identity today, it doesn't mean it's not going to be there next week again. But it's the process of just understanding our own fluidity and what shows up, and being aware enough to deal with what's showing up. And I mean, Arnold Mandel says a leader's second training is awareness. And, all of this is dead in the water without the aspect of awareness, because it's only helpful when we develop awareness around these aspects, acknowledge them, and are willing to engage with them. So that was my 5 cents.
Excellent. Thank you. From Mandel, who has a lot of value. I like the idea of dropping of identity, because that comes up in the stuckness research. And that there's some sort of a parachute or maneuverability when you're not so fixed to whatever version of yourself you fixed.
Yeah.
I'm sorry to put you on the spot. Please let me carry the pain of not being a global Enneagram expert.
Well, we just quickly changed my identity from what you had kind of put me on, and I quickly had to just pass it back.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Is anybody else sitting with any burning questions or?
I'm going to take up space one last time because I have a burning question around, Ashley, you said that your participants primarily fell back to the third order or socialized or diplomat. That I've covered them all. You said, Julia, that Aephoria is diplomat, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So, so why do you think that is? I think that's really fascinating, and I wonder if it's the population of participants that you studied and where their measured center of gravity is. So, or if it's something else.
No, I think it definitely has a lot to do with that. And I've been thinking actually a lot about this lately, and going back to this notion of understanding self, and then self in relationship to others and maybe a group, and that maybe in that three space, that socialized space, it's coming back to something that feels good. It feels like home. There's like a protection there if you fall back into kind of what others think of you, or where you have previously been a part of something so fused together, almost like a settling back into a self that seemed more comfortable. And I don't know, I haven't probed that part of the data that much since having done the study, but there's something there, and I can't quite put my finger on it, but it's something about, to me, I'm wondering if it's about falling back into something that feels like you're not alone, that you're part of something, even if that something isn't that great, that's a safe space to fall into. Like I can fall back into a good daughter role because I know that my mom's going to take care of me, even though I'm 40 years old, but I'm the baby of the family, kind of thing. But it wouldn't feel good to me personally to fall back into a two space, because that to me seems very against my moral code of ethics, right? To kind of be out just for me. Like I want to be a part of something, almost like a tribal or a community perspective. So that doesn't totally answer your question, but you've hit on something that I've been kind of ruminating about a lot lately, about what is that space and that socialized mindset, and how we sort of socially construct these things with each other. And if that is a reason why, if there's something about being in relation, having that relationship, having it instead of being in it, that it's comforting or protective of some sort.
I think that's a really fascinating area to explore. If there are certain, and my assumption is that our coaching clients often are in this 3 to 4 space, like in the space of where your participants were. So I wonder if in that space, one, we can, that's more acceptable for us to fall back to that, as you mentioned. And if it is different with post-conventional individuals, those further along the developmental spectrum, because I feel like in my research with people on their lived experience, and they do tend to fall more in that post-conventional perspective or part of the spectrum, that there is more exploration of the opportunist second order self in fallback, you know, like Julia mentioning owning her bully. You know, that I wonder if we allow ourselves to see certain aspects of fallback, certain aspects of ourself in fallback at different stages of development. Because what we know about fallback is that the further along you are developmentally, it may seem like you're falling back more frequently. The reality is you're just seeing it more. You notice it more. You're more aware of when that happens. And so I wonder if you can see it. And I think this was in David McCallum's study. You can see it in the conventional stages of development, but maybe you're only able to see what feels acceptable to you, not the full range of hot messiness.
Yeah, interesting. It's a great question. Or the possibility that one actually is never in the center of one's gravity. One is always in some version of fallback. It's either 5 steps behind or 4.
The fluidity of oneself.
Nice. There's quite a lot of chat on the chat room about the Enneagram version of fallback. And there's quite a lot of Enneagram specialists here. And I'm wondering if any of them want to comment. There's Enneagram teachers here. Lots. So I think oh, yay, she's in. Hello. Hit it.
I lost power for a minute there, so that was what happened. So you mentioned the Enneagram, and here I am.
Fantastic.
So the Enneagram junkie has to say, in the Enneagram, we have a very, very complexified, as in differentiated and integrated view of exactly what fallback looks like for different subtypes, and there are 54 of them altogether. And so I think that adds a lot of value in terms of self-recognition, self-reading, and also the ability to manage things like shame with self-compassion, because it allows for a detachment from those patterns and a meta-perspective. So I'm wondering why the Enneagram hasn't been more embraced within the world of adults' ego development theory. Obviously, I think it's the best thing ever to hit the planet.
Anybody want to comment on that?
So I'm fairly new to the Enneagram, and so I'm just learning little bits as I go, and I do find it fascinating. So I am hoping to learn more about that and even take an assessment soon to sort of see where perhaps I fall on that as well. But I think all of these have bits and pieces of them that are complementary and supplement and really come together to address this full complexity and fluidity of humans in and of themselves. So I'm excited to learn more about this other perspective myself.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I'm an Enneagram 8, SX8. So when I do fallback, I go like 5. So I find that I do that in fallback. but I also can be quite snippy, like a very bad, dare I say, too. And for me, the Enneagram doesn't, and maybe it's a question of me not knowing enough. So the Enneagram gives you a personality version of fallback, whereas the maturity model, wherever it is, gives a different kind of version. And 27 lines of development. And I don't know, maybe I'm just not that well versed in the Enneagram, but for me, there seems like when I'm in fallback, I'm displaying quite a range of bad behaviors, and not just those associated with my 5. Is that Ingrid?
My sense of that is that the lower levels of health within the Enneagram, down those lines of disintegration, sorry, I'm using technical terminology here, Ashley, and other non-Enneagram people, but what the lines of stress articulate is the line of least resistance when we're under stress. So what happens when we're triggered is that we regress, disintegrate, whatever terminology you use, down to a kind of more primitive response that's more constricted. So our repertoire of behavior is constricted. And we lose our construct awareness, we lose all meta-perspective, fluidity. So we might default to a very narrow way of dealing with the problem. So in something called the harmonics, we'll go into our fixation of either, let's just deal with this problem, or positive outlook, which is very rose-colored spectacles. So there are many, many ways that the Enneagram makes visible and names around these various forms of constriction. So that's what I find particularly helpful, is that you can say to someone, look, that's quite black and white thinking. You might be going down the line to 1. So it provides a self-reading system that is very fluid and dynamic. So in your case, Julia, it wouldn't just be 8 goes to 5. It would be what aspects of sexual subtype 8 are going to sexual subtype 5, and how does that lead from 5 to 7? So you don't, I mean, it's not orthodoxy, but it's a massive vocabulary to allow one to name what's going on for oneself, and to offer a compassionate mirror, because the foundation of the Enneagram is that our own patterns are what cause us suffering and constriction, and that there is a more essential identity. I mean, I'm also very existentialist oriented, so I say that with that hesitation, that it's not some fixed essential self, but there's a conscious agency that is fluid and creative and involved in the process of self-creation and world creation. So, okay, I'm talking a lot, and I hope I've evangelized you enough.
I think it's a very fruitful discussion, actually, to map the way the 2 modalities, methodologies, whatever, work, and see if there's, I mean, I can see there's a lot of complexity there that might be hugely useful in each other's work.
I think the way that these things come together, and this is where my research is what self-reading systems are we using? So in the leadership development work, if we offer an adult development kind of maturity model, there's the kind of not so subtle normative claim or assertion that it's better to move up this ladder and we're going to help you. With the Enneagram, a similar thing. There are 9 levels of health within every type. We're going to help you to find ease from the restrictions of your ingrained habits, etc. So they map very, very well together. And I mean, there doesn't need to be an attachment to a particular system of self-interpretation or whatever, any normative system. But it is a very rich one. And the thing I like about it is that it's very, very fluid.
Yeah. I love the fluidity, but you know, what it always just reminds me is it really speaks to the quality of coaches. Yeah. Like really less mature coaches or less cognitively developed coaches would find this all gray because they can't see the conceptual nuances within this. And it would just appear bland and gray because there's such a cognitive requirement for this, and even a sophisticated languaging requirement for highlighting the nuance, you know, exactly as Ingrid said. And that a lot of the systems of sense making are really quite basic. And, you know, like early surgery was a bottle of vodka, a saw, and a hammer.
And some of our coaching models look quite similar. On a panel beat you, get ready.
Yeah, get ready. Great. Okay, so we always like to end on time. It's really been a fascinating discussion, and I thank Ashley for sharing your research and your experience, your enormous contribution, and Valerie for adding to the wealth of knowledge, and to the rest of you for bringing your experience and making this research pragmatic and live in your coaching practice. I'm going to send a recording and a copy of all of the references. Sharon will send that to you tomorrow. So Ashley, thank you enormously. It's taken a while. There's been a hurricane in between us and you, but now we've found each other. And so please feel free to attend any of our conversations. Now we know you're awake at this time.
That's right. And I do appreciate it so much. And I look forward to it anytime.
Thank you.